peanut butter and jelly, ketchup and mustard, salt and pepper, Peter and Miles. After his intro in the 2018 Insomniac game that pretty much started a whole new craze behind Spider-Man on mainline platforms for video games, it was inevitable that Miles Morales would become playable at some point, but whether or not he was going to get his own standalone game or was simply just going to be a facet of gameplay in the sequel was left up for discussion. And his inclusion in that original storyline, along with his actual origin story, meant that this was definitely a setup. But the end credits scene in that game meant that Sony, along with PlayStation, wanted to really ramp this up, especially with the way that Miles Morales was becoming a bit more prevalent in the culture of Spider-Man with the release of Into the Spider-Verse, his inclusion in the comics being a bit more prevalent. And so we were very surprised to learn that very much into the pandemic, when we were all kind of just shut into our own homes, Sony, through a state of play, decided to announce that he was getting his own standalone game in 2020, let alone after the onset of the pandemic, meaning that this was in the development cycle all along. And the surprise was quite literal. This was announced in June of 2020 for release of November of that year, along with the launch of the PlayStation 5. How they managed to keep this all under wraps? Who knows? Everybody was flabbergasted, to say the least, myself included, and I told myself that if the opportunity presented itself, I really wanted to pick up a PlayStation 5 and play this natively there firsthand as my first run-through experience. But then more details of the game started to come to light that kind of tempered my expectations. Some early gameplay slices and trailers definitely made it clear that they were reusing most of the New York assets. It's both a launch title for the hard-to-find PlayStation 5 at the time and the PlayStation 4, and the developers over at Insomniac clarified that this is not necessarily a full game like the original. This was going to be a much more tapered down experience, but not necessarily at the behest of undercutting the development for the character of Miles Morales. It wasn't going to be a DLC like the City That Never Sleeps pack, which in and of itself hinted at Peter training Miles to be the new Spider-Man in those cutscenes, serving as a form of prelude to what was to come. Interest was definitely high, but many feared it to be kind of a simple copy and paste of the original with a Miles skin. With the way that the video game industry likes to do that nowadays, you can't really blame a lot of people for going with those expectations. But 3 years later, it became clear it was more than just skin deep. Despite some technical limitations here and there that don't land as well as they could have, Spider-Man Miles Morales proves to be his own Spider-Man both as a character and as a game. Let's take a look at 3 years of uniqueness and identity with Spider-Man Miles Morales. With the turnaround of the game being so quick, even with another game in development on the side, aka Rift Apart, a good chunk of those elements are going to be all too similar, so an awful lot of reused assets are going to become a mainstay in this standalone, and frankly that's okay. Character models, as far as quality is concerned, are about the same, which is pretty good, and New York still looks beautiful with performance ray tracing turned on using the power of the PlayStation 5 effectively. Being that this was my first run through at the time, it definitely was quite a looker, and it's really no different 3 years later. In fact, I played this already now 3 times, and each time it's been on the PlayStation 5, so it would have been difficult to go back to the PS4 version. Though now looking back at my recent third run on the PlayStation 5, maybe I should have gone to last gen consoles. I don't know if it was a recent patch release or a corrupted save file, but I encountered many more glitches than I did in my prior runs, including a hard crash back to the XMB and moments of Miles being stuck inside of a building or within invisible walls, a couple little mishaps here and there, prompting me to restart certain checkpoints. Having said that, almost every technical aspect of the game is still covered in what I mentioned before, identity, with the majority of the story taking place in Miles' newfound neighborhood of Harlem after moving from Brooklyn. Even though you can swing across the whole island like in the original game, it's all coated with this wintry embrace of the Christmas season. I replayed this game to be able to capture the footage for this video in August, and yet the sights and sounds of the holidays still managed to melt my Grinchy heart and grow it about half the size more. Not gonna go 3 times, let's say about half. And the changing of the seasons definitely brings out a new kind of aesthetic, a new feel to the way that the community kind of comes together and feels a bit more friendly than I remember them being back in the 2018 original, and the environment still oozes with culture and the proper interpretation of diversity, the way that Harlem really kind of transcends in real life, showing what all walks of life can bring to the table in Miles' interactions with these people, whether with the mask or not, and they perfectly exemplify this. Even when not all interactions are positive, and that's okay. It just makes the sandbox much more natural within the context of the time and setting, especially after many of these community members not being used to one Spider-Man, let alone two Spider-Man working New York. Speaking of Miles, let's talk about that awesome, influential, and highly important exaggerated swagger of that black teen. Yeah, we're never letting that review live down, are we? Jokes at the expense of that GameSpot review aside, to quote Sam Wilson in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier,
"He's out of line, but he's right."
Virtually every aspect of Miles' mobility, from his running, to his jumping, to his combat, and yes, even the swinging, which is still as fluid and as addicting as it was in the main game, have all been imbued with different animations to signify how much he's not a simple reuse of Peter's mechanics and overall skeleton build. Feeding into the theme of identity tackled in the story, Insomniac was no slouch in making sure that that element also translated into the game model for Miles and how you play as him. Sure, some elements remain kind of routine for Spider-Man, such as the actual button layout of the controller to punch, kick, web, and swing, but they're just different enough to approach each scenario with some encouragement to try different things. Mainly if you're playing this for the first time, which I clearly wasn't. Yep, just like the original video essay of the 2018 original, I opted to play this on New Game Plus for my third run, which meant that not only did I have all the skills available, but all the costumes and gadgets as well. Thankfully, I don't know if it was just me, but the tutorial segments I criticized in the original game aren't as present here as that original game, and I kind of brisked enough through everything to kind of subdue them better than I did when I was playing as Peter. One of the elements I theorized helped this was the brisk runtime compared to that of its predecessor. Leading up to release, the developers reiterated that this was going to be a much shorter experience than the first game, but not short enough or lean enough to classify it as DLC. Think Far Cry New Dawn or Uncharted The Lost Legacy, and as such was released at a slightly discounted price of $50 day one. The main quest length takes about roughly between 7 to 8 hours to complete, and therefore doesn't have the expense to slow down or break down every single mechanic even in New Game Plus, so I appreciated that. It also helps that to be able to streamline an awful lot of the different activities you could do throughout the map, you have this new mobile app developed by Genki. And trust me, I really want to see this come back in the sequel, not just for Miles, but also for Peter as well. It manages to funnel everything and streamline the activities throughout the city instead of having to fully explore it through swinging. Yes, this feeds into the addicting nature of the swinging and it never gets old, but it's cool to see that ever so often you just want to get into combat, you really want to get into the thick of it of these different activities and be able to stop crime. So being able to kind of streamline the entirety of that to go from one spot to the next to be able to take down bad guys through this app is really appreciated. However, like I mentioned before, this is New Game Plus, and by default this means that there's not going to be any need for any of those supply crates spread across the city, which in turn made that little alert that pops out at the bottom of the screen saying supply crate nearby a little bit of a nuisance. Yeah, I guess this replaces the little tutorial captions I was nitpicking the last time. A small price to pay though, because if it meant having the Venom Strike and invisibility cloaking mechanics earlier than usual, oh yes, I'm down for it. These were in fact the two biggest differences Miles has in already slightly diluted arsenal compared to that of Peter's. Just when I was beginning to miss the web trip mine from the original during my stealth takedowns, I remembered at the back of my head that I could simply just press up on the D-pad and poof, I am gone. Not only were these two welcome additions to kind of diversify Miles' gameplay, but then you add the different skills and perks to either make the Venom Strike replenish faster or the invisibility stay around longer so you can stay cloaked up longer. I would dare say that this sometimes made Miles just a little OP during my third run. And yes, I even raised the difficulty to spectacular, just like I did with my third run of the original game for that video essay, and I barely even died during combat. I want to say I died in less than what I can count on one hand. In hindsight, I probably even should have raised it higher to amazing, just to see exactly what different things happen, because as of right now, similar to the 2018 game, raising it to spectacular simply just makes the enemies a bit spongier. And I guess speaking of those hideouts and the different compounds where you have to go in and take down the enemies to be able to complete certain objectives, are a good a segue as any to be able to talk about what exactly Miles can do around the city as far as mission structure. Though the story is compacted into a shorter span, like I mentioned before, it's able to pace out its introduction to activities and side missions a little better than Peter's game. Sure, it may not have the most bombastic and staple opening 2 hours I focused on in that original video, since that would literally make up a quarter of the existing campaign, just 2 hours, but it still manages to make a splash with its opening Rhino Chase boss fight to give you a taste of what that Venom power can do, and then subsequently thrust you into the open world to be New York's only Spider-Man, or at least until Pete gets back. Until then, you got your usual suspects of side content: enemy strongholds, facilities that need shutting down, collectibles scattered around the city, and trial challenges organized by Peter and award you accordingly depending on how well you do. I have to confess, however, I couldn't help but not feel too compelled to do some of these activities outside of their introduction in the main story. I felt like they lacked the extra incentive as the original, and that could be in part to how truncated the campaign really was because of how short it was. Well, the fact that I already had everything leveled up and upgraded, so there was really no need for me to do the trials to get the extra components to level myself up and to upgrade my arsenal. Replacing the backpacks from the original game are time capsules, and even though they may not have as many Easter eggs or lore information as Peter's history as Spider-Man, they're much more interpersonal for Miles as it connects him to the people who are or were close to him. And you guessed it, I ended up doing all the time capsules because I love that kind of stuff. But other than that, I left most of the side activities sort of unfinished. Even the side missions suffer from the same problem as the last game. They lack that compelling nature of engagement to feel fully realized. Sure, there's no screwball this time, thank God, but if Howard loses his goddamn pigeons one more time in Spider-Man 2, I'm going to lose it. Now, you may have noticed that there are some notable side activities I neglected to mention, but due to how embedded they are to certain side characters, I'm going to save it, as well as certain post-game stuff for later, because more importantly, I think it ties severely to what separates Miles Morales from the 2018 game: the writing, for better and for worse.
Sorry about this, nephew.
As you load up the main menu for Miles Morales, you hear new tracks composed by John Paisano, returning from scoring the first game, but something is drastically different. The music, using electronic sounds and hip-hop beats, immediately resonates with the player and delivers the clear message. Paisano's heroic themes and orchestral fusion is still there to remind us that we're playing a superhero game, but the way he's able to adapt a natural sound for Miles and incorporate it into the score makes it clear this is a new Spider-Man. A different Spider-Man, a Spider-Man with an identity. As he steps out of the train station, you get a sense of what Miles, the 17-year-old, is. He's so in tune with himself that he grew an extra foot and managed to finally clean up that haircut, thank God. But when duty calls, it becomes apparent he's not so in tune yet to being his own Spider-Man. Unlike Peter, the 8-year history is reduced to a mere 1, and like mentioned before, the way Miles composes himself during movement and combat embodies that. And that's completely okay. It's relatable, compelling, and makes us root for him, likely more so than Peter. I just hope that with great experience comes great octaves. I understand he's only 17, but even during my third run, his voice is still leaning towards the slightly twangier side that just kind of gets on my nerves a little bit, and in no way, shape, or form is that the fault of Najee Jeter's performance. He nails the excitement Miles has wanting to be Spider-Man, and the pain and struggle he feels when needing to be Spider-Man. The moments in between, though, maybe the direction he was given was to be a little too much on the younger side. And again, that's no fault of Najee Jeter himself. It's just the way that he was probably directed or instructed to do his voice so that it matches that of a 17-year-old, or at least a perspective of what the writers and the people directing the game felt the 17-year-old Miles needed to be. And that's a criticism not just on his voice. Sadly, the dialogue and the interactions between the characters suffers from what a lot of people have come to know as the MCU dialogue effect. It may just be me, but Miles' Avenger had more cringe dialogue than I remember even in 2020 when I first played it. That's not to say that the original was absolved of any occasional eye-rolling corny lines by Peter, but it was easier to digest because of a character like Yuri calling him out on his corniness, or being a product of a longer and more stretched out experience, so you have much more spacing in between the cringy jokes. Being only about 8 hours means that there's very little room for flat jokes to hide this time around, and they stand out just a little bit more during my third run. This makes me hope in a very morbid kind of way that the dark turn of events in Spider-Man 2 will leave some of these cringy lines at the door. On the brighter side, the briskness of the campaign also means that there's very little room for fluff as well, and the pacing feels a lot more fluid. Even though I've already played it 3 times, it was still very easy for me to miss the third act pivot I'm usually able to pin out in movies, games, and even books. Gripes aside, Miles is still very much the most suitable anchor for this kind of narrative, and seeing the stakes rise against him in his newfound home of Harlem gives him a chance to understand what it means to be New York's only friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. As Miles swings from story beat to story beat, our favorite Spider-Man commentator turns to offer his rage-fueled, high blood pressure takes on the web slinger, creating some hilarious—
Gotta be something better on.
Wait, what?
Been hearing good things about this one.
Hello, I'm Danica Hart, and this is the Danicast.
Yeah, Miles Morales decided to change it up a bit to keep in line with its own individuality by introducing a brand new podcaster who supports Spider-Man, named Danica Hart of the Danicast. Though you can see her walking out of the bodega at the beginning of the game, it's kind of like a little buried Easter egg there, Danica's proper intro comes in the form of Miles switching the feed inside of his suit, but sadly, I personally don't feel like it hits the same way that Just the Facts with Jameson does. Prolific voice actor Ashley Birch does a good job of making Danica her own, but it cemented an issue I was already wrestling with at that point. The writing is just not that strong, and nothing embodies that more than the Underground, led by the Tinkerer. During one of her episodes, Danica mentions she's working to expose the Underground and why it is that they're going after Newform, an experimental energy source being commercialized by Roxxon, who's moved it into Harlem to do their dealings. Not everyone is enthused by this, most especially the Tinkerer, the secretive, mysterious leader of the Underground, who's out to expose Roxxon's nefarious intentions with their hidden, covert agenda, using bleeding-edge technology and using espionage to conceal her identity so that she can— Yeah, it's Finn. It's Finn. All right, we can already tell. It's Finn. It's Finn. Come on. I mean, I'm sorry, I have to do it again. What's with these oblivious Spider-Men? Is there really so much going on in their head that they can't notice that the philanthropist who runs a homeless shelter suddenly disappears around the same time that the demons make a move on Norman Osborn? Or that their long-lost childhood friend, who hasn't really contacted them in months, shows up for Christmas dinner, right before the Tinker and her Underground show up in Harlem? Sure, Rio was the one who extended the invite to her for Christmas dinner, but even then, I would be suspicious of that timing from the get-go. The demons weren't exactly the strongest bad guys Peter or Miles would have faced, but the Underground are barely any bigger offenders since they're almost carbon copies of the demons from prior, complete with shooters, brawlers, heavies with shields, whippers, all coated with that ray-traced purple neon, and delivering the usual generic bad guy lines you'd expect. Then there's Finn Mason, who was loosely adapted and gender-swapped from the comics to a rather good effect when in connection to Miles' history and childhood. Her and Miles' love for science is contagious, and the chemistry between them, no pun intended, Venom sparks almost immediately. Okay, that was a pun. I did intend that one. So when the obvious twist of her being the Tinkerer comes into play, it presents a few issues. First of all, I will give some props for taking the Mr. Negative approach and tackling said twist very quickly in the campaign. You could toss this up to being a shorter game, but even then, it's not dragged out as it could have been, presenting Miles with an internal conflict that's very staple for Spider-Man. However, much like Martin Lee, again, her plot for revenge is— well, it's the same. Someone near and dear to them was killed at the expense of a science experiment gone wrong for the sake of money, and they're out to get revenge years later on the person who was hungry after that money at the expense of that loved one. Spider-Man gets caught up in their web, etc., etc. Spider-Man 2018 can maybe get away with this by being the first outing by Insomniac and using it as a template to set up for what's next in the story, and makes the focus of the game and the development on the gameplay. Here, however, there was a chance to make the conflict a bit more unique and centralized for Miles since the running theme with him was all about individuality and uniqueness. Now with those rose-colored glasses removed 3 years later and not being blinded by the reflections of Miles' suit in the power of the PS5, I was kinda disappointed in how short the antagonizing force Miles must take on came off this time. Finn also kinda lost a little bit of her case exacting revenge 3 years later, as now I noticed just how many times Miles would try to talk to her very reasonably, almost to a fault, and then in turn it makes Finn even harder to empathize with and kind of a jerk. Making matters worse is the actual person Finn is trying to exact revenge on, Simon Krieger. Even his name is forming as we speak an extra appendage so that it could take the mustache that's on that last R of his last name and twist it. Because that's exactly what he is. This is as generic as a bad guy can get. And sure, I can blatantly hear how much fun he's only in every video game Troy Baker is having. But it's not enough to save how bland this guy is written. At least Martin Lee was going up against Norman Osborn, who not only has his roots embedded into the comic source material, but had his own personal reasons as to why he was conducting those experiments. He was trying to save his son, while making his own little profit on the side. Sure, that's Norman Osborn. This guy is literally all about money. There's no empathetic anchor, to the point that he even has a line.
You know what that smells like to me, kid? That smells like money.
Again, not the strongest material from the writing team, and it didn't really age well after the past 3 years, resulting in moments where I felt kind of disconnected from some of the cutscenes and interactions, and I felt much more passive with the game than I did with 2018 Spider-Man. For a while, I was wondering if I held a personal bias, or like I mentioned in other videos, I've turned into a salty curmudgeon and it's difficult for me to enjoy games as much these days because of who I am. Much like with Miles after the bridge collapse, which is an awesome action set piece, I was doubting myself, but this time as a gamer and as a fan of Insomniac's follow-up, until I started to comb the footage I captured for this video and found myself replaying over and over this particular moment. Aside from the perfect edits between Miles creating the suit, Miles using the suit out in the field and flaunting it, and matching it to Lecrae's "This is my time," there was a much needed message conveyed by this montage that gets to me to watch it over and over and over, even while editing this video. Miles needs to make his own suit. He has to go over the trial and error of adapting his newfound powers into the suit, and likewise adapting into becoming his own Spider-Man. Should Peter have made the final mark of the suit as opposed to the founding prototype, it would have robbed Miles of the task that encapsulates his identity as the new Spidey, something carried over from the Into the Spider-Verse movie and the comics as well, and has become a form of unwritten rule. Miles needs to make his own suit, or at the very least put the final personal touches on it. What I found to be even more compelling here is that he doesn't necessarily do it alone. His best friend Genki, knowing of his secret identity, is the ultimate guy in the chair, not only helping Miles develop his suit, but also creating the friendly neighborhood app mentioned earlier that streamlines all the crime throughout the city for both Miles and the player. All while putting out a mobile RPG. This man is the GOAT, especially over the douche in Across the Spider-Verse. I mean, I'm sorry, I love that movie, but I hope that they fix Genki in the final installment to an extent, because so far he's just some lazy piece of set dressing, who somehow got access to Marvel's Spider-Man 2 early. Genki's not the only one to figure out Miles' secret. By the end of our tale, Miles' mother Rio, who was running for Congress after the fallout of the events of Devil's Breath, and Miles' troubled uncle Aaron find out, and the writing for these characters and Miles' revelation to them is one of the game's greatest strengths and most unique aspects when compared to Peter's adventure. In the original game, very few knew about his identity because of how many people suffered for it, whether they were confirmed by Insomniac or remained speculative as far as his past is concerned. I mean, we have yet to know for certain if Gwen Stacy has ever existed in this universe or if she has yet to arrive, and if so, if she'll ever meet a comic-accurate fate. Despite how much of a cautionary tale Peter's background was in that game, Miles takes a different path, bringing in Genki, Rio, and Aaron into the know and reinforcing the culture of family he was raised on. Sure, the relationship between him and Aaron and the family may not have panned out for the best, but his inclusion as the Prowler, with the unmasking treated briskly and intelligently as to not ruin the pacing of the game, he brings so much more to the table than he's given credit for. This brings me to the side quests I mentioned before that I wanted to save for my final point in defense of Miles Morales. After Miles learns of his uncle's dealings as the Prowler, Aaron tells him to go to a certain location on the map that kicks off the music sampling side quest. In my opinion, my favorite quest out of the entire game, more so than the time capsules even. Deciphering Aaron's riddle and finding the corresponding sound within the boxed area is serviceable, but what brings it all together is Aaron's little backstory at the end of every find, providing context as to why the sound is important and how it ties to Miles' dad, Jefferson. It makes Aaron a much more tragic character, and it reinforces what Miles is fighting for. Jeff's final words from the first game are then punctuated with yet another heart-pulling side quest that is not unlocked until after you beat the main game. Shortly after witnessing Finn's death at the hands of Miles' Venom explosion, which I'll admit is still a beautiful sequence after 3 years, Rio attempts to console Miles on his birthday with a scavenger hunt throughout the city. A gesture so thoughtful, loving, and heartwarming, I'm willing to suspend the disbelief that Rio had enough time outside of her campaigning to put these damn things all over New York. She has better time management than Batman was to set up that fire symbol in Dark Knight Rises. Jokes aside, this officially made Rio Morales one of the best mother figures in not just Insomniac's Spider-Man universe, but practically all of Spider-Man in general. So she must be protected at all costs, even against Peter himself. Hey, now that's an interesting theory. Once you begin the hunt, Miles gets the wind knocked out of him at the sound of his own father, recorded on the drives attached to the postcards hidden throughout the city. Much like the music sampling mission, the scavenger hunt is deeply rooted into what makes Miles likable and unique. This is arguably one of the most poignant post-credit missions I've played, not just for the Spider-Man franchise, but recent modern games as well, serving as a form of epilogue and period on Miles' solo chapter before moving on to the mainline sequel. He's finally able to let go of his grief over his father and develop his own life experiences as both Miles and Spider-Man, hoping his uncle will do the same. Both Aaron's music sampling quest and the scavenger hunt mission end with character-fitting rewards as well. Ever the pragmatist, Aaron leaves a Prowler-themed suit for Miles, and the last postcard yields a simple yet beautiful memory of Miles playing ball with his family, including Finn, years before the events of the 2018 game. Combine all this with the black and gold suit you get from the neighborhood that you ended up protecting by going through all of the crime events listed on the app, and it's made perfectly clear this is what gives Miles his identity. It's his community, his family, and his culture. The people he turns to in his early tenure as Spider-Man is what makes him stand out as the most unique Spider-Man, maybe even more so than other Spider people. I mean, besides Peter. Peter is the OG, but think about it. Aside from the unique visual flair that some other Spider people may flaunt, not too many people can remember their alter ego names. But show them this, and by now almost everyone on the street knows that this is Miles Morales. And that's what this game was all about. Not setting out to be the definitive, refined version of its predecessor, but to be the most unique, the most individualistic. Pragmatically speaking, yes, it makes sense to take existing assets, mechanics, and so many other factors from the prior game and put them into this one. It's the sensible thing to do to cut down on time, budget, and resources, and it leaves room for improvements and creative ideas to fit should time and money allow it. Some of them worked, and some of them may not, but that's okay. Not only do we have the imminent official sequel just around the corner, but the real opportunity to explore creativity, culture, and identity was with an intermediate spin-off game, something Spider-Man 2, no matter how amazing it may end up being, will not be able to take away. After bearing the responsibility of the first game, both Miles and Insomniac allowed themselves the greatest power to be themselves.